All right. Well, welcome, folks. Thank you very much for coming this evening. So before we get started, I would just like to start with some prayer. So we're going to use a prayer from C.S. Lewis, the Apologist's Evening Prayer. So, from all my lame defeats, and oh much more, from all the victories left that I seemed to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which, while angels weep, the audience laugh. From all my proofs of thy divinity, thou, who wouldst give no sign, deliver me. Thoughts are but coins, let me not trust, instead of thee, their thin-worn image of thy head. From all my thoughts, even from my thoughts of thee, O thou fair silence fall, and set me free. Lord of the narrow gate and the needle's eye, take from me all trumpery, lest I die. Lord, though you call us to love you with all of our hearts, minds, and strength, help us not to become totally reliant on our own ideas and arguments on your behalf. Lord God, we do not need apologetics, we need you. In the name of our way, our truth, and our life, we pray. Amen. Thank you very much. Okay, so what is the title of this evening's talk? It's Historicity of the Resurrection. But what do I mean by historicity? So historicity is assessing the historical authenticity. In other words, is an alleged historical fact actually true? So, what do I mean by a minimal facts approach to arguing for the resurrection then? Well, it means that the argument does not assume that New Testament documents are inspired or even accurate in every single detail. It argues from facts that are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars and good evidence to believe they are true. So even if the rest of the New Testament is false, these facts remain true, which is handy because those skeptical scholars doubt the historicity of the entire New Testament will be using facts that the majority agree to be true. However, we're going to be focusing specifically on the historicity of Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay, so Jesus' death. What are the facts? Number one, Jesus died by crucifixion just outside of Jerusalem. So Jesus' death by crucifixion at the hands of Pilate is almost unanimously accepted by scholars. Skeptical scholar John Dominic Crossan says it's as sure as anything historical can be. Another skeptical scholar, E.P. Sanders, calls it one of the most indisputable facts about Jesus' life. There is no real question for historians whether Jesus died by crucifixion. The second claim, Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb. The evidence for this claim is also pretty compelling. We have multiple attestation, which means that sources independent from one another agree. From Mark and Paul, and the Jewish historian Josephus attests also that crucified victims were allowed to receive a proper burial. Jewish law demanded that even foreigners and criminals had to be buried, as can be found in Deuteronomy. Here, Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. The burial of Jesus in a tomb also meets what is called the criteria of embarrassment, which is a critical assessment, which basically means that an account that is embarrassing to the author is presumed likely to be true because the author would have had no reason to invent an embarrassing account of themselves. The gospel accounts admit disciples could not afford their own tomb and had to borrow one from members of the court, which had just had him killed. Admittedly, a few scholars deny that Jesus was buried in a tomb, but they are very much in the minority. But more on that later. However, both of these facts could still be true, and Jesus would still be dead and buried. What we really want to know is what happened next. What happened that led us all to be sitting here 2,000 years later, still talking about it? So the most popular theories to explain the resurrection are the mythic theory, the conspiracy theory, the hallucination theory, and the resurrection theory. So, for the mythic theory, all the events and miracle claims of Jesus were made up at a later time and not taught, or made up by early witnesses. The second is the conspiracy theory. This is probably the earliest competing theory to challenge Jesus' resurrection, and entails that the disciples made up the resurrection of the story rising from the dead and simply lied about it for the rest of their lives. The hallucination theory comes in many forms and is probably the most popular among skeptical New Testament scholars. And basically, the theory goes that the disciples had vivid hallucinations in their grief, that Jesus had risen and compelled them to think he was alive again. The last one, the resurrection theory, is pretty self-explanatory. This is basically Jesus died, he rose again from the dead, and the disciples believed it because they saw it with their own eyes. So we're going to look at the facts through these lenses to see how well they explain the data. So we'll start off with the fact that the disciples were convinced. There's not a lot of doubt among scholars that the disciples believed that they'd met the risen Lord Jesus. A skeptic, Bart Ehrman, says, "I don't doubt at all that some disciples claimed to have met the risen Jesus. Paul, writing about 25 years later, indicates that this is what they claimed, and I don't think he's making it up." Another skeptical scholar, E.P. Sanders, says it is an equally secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, in what sense is not certain, after his death. Thereafter, his followers saw him. So, where do we have evidence that the disciples were convinced? Well, within the Bible, we have writings within Paul's epistles, within Mark, John, Matthew, Luke, and Acts. And outside of the Bible, we also have the writings of Josephus. So the reason isn't doubted because it has multiple attestation from the sources listed behind me. And there is no way to explain the rise of Christianity unless the disciples thought they'd met the risen Jesus. Something had to have happened to the disciples that compelled them to go out and start telling people that they'd met Jesus once again. But people claim to have seen all sorts of things. Why should we take the claims of the disciples seriously? How do we know that their testimony is reliable and they're not simply making it up? To do this, let's look at when eyewitness testimony is deemed reliable or unreliable. So, eyewitness testimony is deemed unreliable under the following circumstances. 1, events happened quickly. 2, you expect something to happen. 3, when the people involved are strangers. Or 4, they've got a gun. Let's dig into each of those a little bit more. So number 1, events happen quickly. Eyewitness testimony is often unreliable when events unfold quickly, as it is hard to properly recall all the details of an event. Number 2, you expect something to happen. Alternatively, when people go out looking for what they want to find, you know that if you go to Loch Ness fully intent on finding Nessie, you're more likely to fool yourself into thinking you found something. Or maybe 3, when the people involved are strangers. Believe it or not, it is harder to retain memory and remember details when you are around unfamiliar people. Or 4, they've got a gun, or any other weapon for that matter, for the simple reason that fear not only clouds your memory, but forces you to pay more attention to the weapon than other details or events. Explaining the disciples' testimonies, however, none of these seems to be a factor. The risen Jesus does not appear with a weapon, nor when there is a weapon present. Nor were the disciples with unfamiliar people. They'd been living out of each other's pockets for the best part of 3 years. They knew each other, and they certainly knew Jesus. Nor did the disciples expect Jesus to rise. Despite the numerous times Jesus told them he was going to rise from the dead, the Gospels embarrassingly report the disciples misunderstood Jesus' claims and the Scriptures. And Jesus' appearances aren't mere flashes that happen quickly. He walks, talks, and eats with his followers. Even if you pretended that the Gospels and Acts were myths, we read in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appeared to multiple people, multiple times. So the appearances of Jesus do not appear in circumstances that seem to create unreliable eyewitness testimony. So were these accounts just made up at a later date? This idea is rejected by most scholars, as in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul preserves an early creed which includes a list of witnesses: Peter, the rest of the disciples, over 500 people at once, James, and all the apostles. Let's have a read of Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 18. "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. Scholars believe this is a creed because it contains mnemonic parallelism, in other words, features that repeat and are easy to remember. That Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised, that he appeared, then he appeared, and he appeared, and he also appeared. And it's in less than 50 words. They believe the creed is incredibly early in formation because Paul tells the Corinthians he received it in the manner of a rabbinic statement of a teacher passing on what he himself was taught. New Testament scholar James Dunn notes, on a number of occasions, Paul indicates that he had received and passed on tradition, using technical terms for receiving, paralambano, and passing on, paradidomi, tradition, clearly implying that this was an important facet both of beginning a new life as a Christian, catechesis, and of founding a new church, meaning this had to have come earlier than Paul. It also calls Peter Cephas. Cephas was an earlier name for Peter. Peter came later on. The appearance to James is independent from the Gospels, indicating that it wasn't lifted from them either. This creed has been dated to between a few months by Dunn and at an absolute maximum 3 years by atheist Gerd Ludemann after Jesus' death. If this is the case, then the appearance reports are early too, meaning they couldn't have been made up later. This rules out the mythic theory. So, maybe the disciples were convinced because of hallucination. The problem for the hallucination theory is that the appearances happen in group settings. Group hallucinations are exceptionally rare, and because of this, the scientific literature explaining them is also exceptionally rare. 2. As clinical psychologist Gary Sipke says, I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books during the last 2 decades and have yet to find a single documented case of group hallucination. The problems for the hallucination theory is that most peer-reviewed work on hallucinations concludes that hallucinations most often occur in one sensory mode. In other words, either hearing them, so auditory or visual, and that multi-mode hallucinations, such as seeing and hearing, are exceptionally rare. Yet, the appearances of Jesus contain both of these elements, which already makes the hallucination theory seem improbable. For the hallucination theory to hold water, you would have to say that the disciples are having a rare group hallucination in which each member of the group is having an exceptionally rare hallucination and they're all hallucinating the same thing multiple times. In other words, the probabilities stack up against each other, making this rarer and rarer and rarer. But what about the power of suggestion, I hear you cry? Can't some people cause others, people to believe that they're hallucinating something similar? For example, when one person in a lifeboat thinks they see a ship in the distance and everyone else on the lifeboat is convinced of this too. In one of the few pieces of literature on group hallucinations, Zune and Jones theorize that group hallucinations can occur when there is expectation, emotional excitement, and prior warning. However, there would tend to be variation in reports. This amongst the individuals present. One famous event that they cite is an event from 1917 where thousands of people claim to have witnessed a public miracle. After 3 children had claimed to have seen apparitions of the Virgin Mary, newspapers reported that Mary had promised to make one final appearance. So, between 30,000 and 100,000 people gathered to watch what has been dubbed the Miracle of the Sun, whereby people claim to have seen, some people claim to have seen Mary, some Saint Joseph, some a spinning disc in the sky, some a radiant colour show, and others nothing at all. Photographs from the event show the sun behaving remarkably normally. For Zune and Jones, a scientific explanation for such a group hallucinations has yet to be established. Though we can see the criteria being fulfilled in the previous example, it does not account for the resurrection appearances. Expectation and excitement were not present at the gospel, as the gospel narratives portray the disciples as not having believed Jesus' claims and also cowering in fear for their lives, going as far as to doubt the reports of the women who'd claimed to have met the risen Jesus and were also frightened when they first encountered Jesus, meaning they were not excited. Nor was there variation in their reports of Jesus' appearances between those present. All the accounts portray him as resurrected in the body, looking sort of like himself, but a little bit different. Scholar William Lane Craig puts it like so: there is not a single instance in the casebooks exhibiting the diversity involved in the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. So could it have been a spiritual experience? Even if the Gospels are ignored and deemed unreliable, you'd still have to account for the earliest Christians preaching a bodily resurrection of Jesus and not a spiritual appearance. The early Christians were very familiar with visions and claims to have had some themselves, as you could read about in Acts 12, verses 14 to 15. Christians understood visions and spiritual experiences, yet they never interpreted Jesus' appearance like this. A skeptical scholar, Gerd Ludemann, says, "We have no sound way to place the symbolic representation of Jesus' resurrection within the context of the earliest Christian resurrection belief." So, in light of this, it is hard to see how the hallucination theory can account for the disciples' belief that they'd met the risen Jesus, because they happened in group settings, they were multi-sensory, there was no variation between the accounts, there was no expectation, no excitement, and were not interpreted to be spiritual. Okay, well, what about conspiracy then? Maybe the disciples were convinced because they were in on it. Before Christ was crucified, the disciples couldn't prevent Judas from betraying them, so it's hard to see how they could keep this under wraps too. However, if all we have to go on is the appearances and no other data, we have to say it's possible the conspiracy theory explains the appearances, if we were to treat the appearances as the only piece of data to go on. The resurrection theory, then, if we take that, unsurprisingly explains the appearances of Jesus to his disciples with relative ease. Seeing as if Jesus rose from the dead, reports of his physical appearance make a modicum of sense. So, when we look at why the disciples were convinced, we know that we can rule out the mythic theory and the hallucination theory, but we're left with the conspiracy theory and the resurrection theory. Okay, let's move on then to the idea of skeptics being convinced. The next piece of data that requires an explanation is how early biblical skeptics became convinced of the resurrection of Jesus. I'm talking about James and Paul here. So James and brothers of Jesus were not his followers before his crucifixion. And if you want to back that up, you can see that in John 7:5 and Mark 3:31-35, where James becomes prominent afterwards. Paul, even more famously, was an enemy of the church and a later convert. So, the first assertion is supported by a wide variety of scholars, including the aforementioned skeptical scholars Ludemann, Ehrman, and Sanders, and the latter is pretty much unanimously accepted. In Galatians 1:23, Paul speaks of himself. "He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy." If you add this to the creed in 1 Corinthians and the account in Acts, we have multiple attestation of Paul's conversion to the faith. It also fulfills the criteria of embarrassment, as Paul himself reports that he was once the enemy of the church and very much in the wrong. Let's go back to James then. So James was a prominent leader in the early church, and we have evidence for that in the following texts. So in Galatians, in 1 Corinthians, and also externally, not within the Bible, from the Jewish historian Josephus, who was no friend of the church or Christians. However, the accounts of the Gospels tell us that during Jesus' ministry, James did not believe he was the Messiah. Indeed, James is not listed as present at Jesus' crucifixion. So what happened that turned these skeptics into believers? Okay, so let's start off again with the mythic theory. The mythic theory has a hard time accounting for this because, as discussed earlier, Paul is an early convert who proclaimed the resurrection almost immediately on conversion. As for James, skeptical scholar Gerd Ludemann and historian Mike Licona state that no early Christian would dare shame a prominent leader of the church by claiming he was once Jesus' enemy. Furthermore, we have multiple sources which attest to James and Paul being leaders within the church. Their conversion was not a myth, and thus rules out the mythic theory for an explanation of that. Okay, what about conspiracy then? Could James and Paul have lied? Well, the question would be, why on earth would they have done that? The early church was a persecuted minority with a supposed Messiah that had just been shamefully crucified. James was already opposed to Jesus. His shameful crucifixion would have done nothing to change this fact. Why would James feel the need to make up a resurrection appearance if there was nothing to gain but shame and dishonour, and suddenly reverse and proclaim his brother as Lord? The same question can be asked of Paul. Paul was a rising leader within the Pharisees and was making a name for himself for persecuting the church. He has everything going for him, and suddenly he has an urge to leave all that behind, join the persecuted minority he'd hated and lie in order to justify it. It doesn't make any sense. What about hallucination then? Could Paul and James have hallucinated the resurrection appearance? Doing so would multiply the assumptions needed to explain the data, but also flies in the face of the aforementioned hallucination criteria. Paul hated the church, so there would have been no excitement or expectation of Jesus' resurrection. If Paul had had a vision or dream, he would have called it as such and would have not proclaimed a bodily resurrection. James may have been grieving, but also did not expect a resurrection, as he was skeptical, and a dying and rising Messiah was not part of the beliefs of Second Temple Judaism. As Mike Licona says, Jesus' execution as a criminal and blasphemer would have supported Jesus' brothers' continued unbelief rather than their conversion. As such, it seems implausible that hallucinations were the cause of Paul and James's conversion. Which leaves us with the resurrection theory then. Seems a no-brainer really, this one. An encounter with the risen Lord Jesus would comfortably explain the sudden conversion of skeptics and those hostile to the early church. So if we look at where we're at so far, we can see that basically we've managed to rule out 3 of the 4. So we've looked over the appearances of Jesus, but that's only half the battle. I mean, we can't interview the people who were there, but what we can do is look at the facts that accompany the appearances and see which theory best explains them. So this section is called Expectation of the Gospel. So first up, the expectation of the gospel to the surrounding world. So, Jesus going to the cross and bearing sin and rising again may sound like the best news in the world to us, but to the ancient world and cultures built on honour and status, such a message would be a horrendous thing to hear. As German theologian Walter Bauer noted, the enemies of Christianity always refer to the disgracefulness of the death of Jesus. A god, or Son of God dying on a cross, that was enough to put paid to the new religion. New Testament scholar David De Silva notes the same thing. Christianity was founded on a premise that should have failed the moment it began in such culture. To the culture of non-Jews, Gentiles, in this case, the Romans and the Greeks, the Christians would have looked crazy. I mean, they were basically saying, worship a man shamefully executed on a cross. Celsus, a Greek philosopher and early opponent of Christianity, in 177 AD, attacked this very idea, mocking Christians for worshipping a god who could not escape the cross. The early Christian apologist Justin Martyr responded to attacks such as these, but it did not sit well with the Gentiles. Jesus was also a Jewish man, which the Romans would have looked down upon. And on top of that, a Jew who was a carpenter, which was also a position that was looked down upon. The great orator, Roman orator Cicero, called carpentry vulgar and compared it to slavery. Christians also preached a bodily resurrection which was completely at odds with pagan theology, which saw the ultimate goal as dying to leave the material world and enter the spiritual one. And finally, Christians placed high ethical demands on their new converts. No extramarital affairs, let alone temple prostitution, and this was very much at odds with Greco-Roman culture of the time. To the Jewish culture, Christianity was just as crazy. The Christians were saying that the Messiah was executed by imperial rulers, the Messiah was from Nazareth, and the Messiah had a shady family history. The Messiah was expected to be a conqueror who would defeat Rome and restore the kingdom of Israel. To follow Jesus was to give up on the Second Temple Jewish idea of an all-conquering Messiah. The Jews would have heard that the Messiah growing up in Nazareth would have been weird, because Nazareth was just a Galilean backwater. As Jesus' detractors say in John 1:46, Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Then we have the fact of what would have been dubbed Jesus' shady family history. Mary became pregnant from someone other than her husband before marriage. In light of these things, the Christians better have had a good reason to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead, because the odds were against them on every front. As N.T. Wright says, Christianity was born into a world where its central claim was known to be false. With this background to the gospel, no group... So could conspiracy be behind this then? So with this background, to the gospel, no group of conspirators would ever have made this their core doctrine. If you're going to make up a message to gain a following, you're going to want to make up something that is appealing and works to your advantage, not the complete opposite. So the conspiracy theory doesn't hold any weight when you dig into the history. What about hallucination then? Well, not really. As we first discussed, Jesus' crucifixion is unanimously accepted, so unless we're going to start actually positing that all of Jerusalem hallucinated Jesus' crucifixion, I don't need to think that we don't need to take that seriously. But let's go with it, even if just for the sake of argument. Grieving people might hallucinate something that gives them comfort. They wouldn't hallucinate something that made their lives significantly more difficult. I mean, even if they had hallucinated Jesus' return, it would have been better to preach a spiritual rise, as that would have met better with pagan and Jewish audiences who weren't expecting a physical resurrection, and a hallucination might have inferred this spiritual return, not a physical body that you could reach out and touch. Okay, what about myth then? We know the crucifixion was preached early, so we don't need to look at the mythic theory any further. Okay, so no points realizing that the resurrection theory explains the data quite well. The Christians preached their message of a dying and rising Messiah who was crucified because that's actually what happened. Okay, so where does that leave us? Again, for expectation of the gospel, it looks like we've ruled out the other three theories and we're left with only the resurrection theory. Moving on to the empty tomb then. This is the final thing I'd like to talk about. With regards to the empty tomb, the skeptical scholar Jacob Kramer notes, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. However, although the majority of New Testament scholars accept arguments for the empty tomb, it's not necessarily a view that is held unanimously. A skeptical scholar I mentioned earlier, J.D. Cressan, felt that Jesus wasn't buried in a tomb, but thrown in a trench for dogs to eat, as the Romans would not have allowed a proper burial for criminals. Dale Allison, a scholar who doubts the physical resurrection, disputes this claim, however, citing the early creed in 1 Corinthians. The Greek word for bury, thapto, which I've got written up there, means to entomb, bury, inter, often with funeral rites, and would not be used for the dumping of criminals in a trench. So the earliest account of Jesus' burial is incompatible with Cressan's argument. As we also discussed earlier, we have multiple attestation from early sources that crucified victims were buried, as well as archaeological evidence of the fact. This image is from the 1st century victim of crucifixion, found in a Jewish tomb bearing the inscription, Johanan, the son of Hagkol. Given this, there's also no reason to see why the Romans wouldn't have allowed this practice then. After all, they allowed other Jewish practices, such as temple worship in rejection of Roman gods, allowed Jews to conduct their own trials, have their own temple guards, and keep the Sabbath. So there's no reason that they wouldn't have allowed the burial of a crucified Jewish man, fitting with the archaeological evidence we have. Jesus' burial also meets the criteria of embarrassment, as the gospel accounts admit the disciples could not afford their own tomb and had to borrow one from Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the ruling council that had just got Jesus killed. The fact that Joseph's name is mentioned suggests that the location of the tomb was public knowledge, meaning if Jesus' tomb wasn't empty, the public could readily debunk the claim. The account of the empty tomb is also embarrassing because it is discovered by women. The testimony of women was very much looked down upon during the first century. In fact, if you look through the sermons and creeds in Acts, they're remarkably silent on the matter. This isn't a contradiction of the Gospels, but you can certainly see the early church skirting over the fact in order not to be dismissed out of hand by their listeners. When it comes to recording the actual events, they cannot be ignored, however. Women were the first observers of the early tomb, a fact that 2nd century detractor Celsus, who I mentioned earlier, used as evidence against the truth of the Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew also mentions the competing theory that the disciples stole the body. If the disciples had stolen the body, why would they mention the competing theory in the accounts, spreading the very claim they'd want to avoid? Interestingly, Justin Martyr argued against Jews who claimed the disciples stole the body, which is an implication that the Jews admit the body could not be found. We also have the Nazareth inscription, which is an imperial decree from around 41 AD, which states the penalty for grave robbing is death. This is interesting because the ancient historian Suetonius tells us there were riots in Rome on account of Chrestus, a common misspelling of Christus, and the Jews were expelled from Rome as a result. If some Jews in Rome were preaching about Christ's resurrection and riots resulted, and Jesus' tomb was not empty, there'd be no need for an imperial decree about grave robbing. You just produce Jesus' body to dispel the riots rather than directly admit the body was missing. So from all sides, Christians, Jews, and Romans, the body is missing, which makes it highly unlikely the empty tomb was just a fabrication, hence why the majority of scholars accept it. So if the body was stolen, who did it? Rome? Why on earth would they have done that? They wouldn't have cared at that point. The Jewish leaders then, maybe. They wanted Jesus crucified, shamed, buried, and forgotten. The disciples seemed the obvious choice. And these were the charges that were levelled against them. But why would they? Their leader was crucified. They were in fear for their own lives, scattered and dispersed. And if they hadn't stolen it, why would they then propagate the story by including the accusation in the Gospels? And if they had stolen the body, they wouldn't have included the fact they initially doubted the women's accounts of the empty tomb, nor would they have included the fact that they had not understood Jesus' predictions about the resurrection. It all meets the criteria of embarrassment. Later Christians would not have made these things up and attacked the honour authority of their leaders, nor would the disciples, unless they wanted to bring shame on themselves. But why? But we'll go with it for just a second. The disciples did steal the body, but where would they have taken it? Remember, this was during Passover. The city would have been flooded with people. They'd have been seen and caught, especially getting the body out of a guarded tomb of a member of the Sanhedrin. For the conspiracy theory to work, you need to posit that the disciples who were in fear of their lives decided to pull the most outrageous hoax. Then fake a resurrection, which was not expected in Second Temple Judaism. Get Jesus' body out of a guarded tomb in a public area of town. Then propagate and die for something they knew to be a lie, gaining absolutely nothing. It's all too convoluted, with so many what-ifs, it doesn't hold water. What about hallucination? It falls short on all the other factions mentioned for previous cases. Unless, of course, everyone hallucinated the tomb was empty. What about myth, then? Gerd Ludemann and J.D. Crossan argue that the empty tomb was made up later as it's not specifically mentioned in the early 1 Corinthians 15 creed. which is true in one sense. I mean, if you look at the creed, nowhere does it say his tomb was found empty. However, it does say he was buried, using the Greek word entomb, often with funeral rites, and that he was raised. It is quite clear that what was buried is also what was raised. So, as a logical consequence, the tomb must have been empty. As N.T. Wright says, the fact the empty tomb does not appear to be specifically mentioned in this passage is not significant. The mention hereof, buried and raised, needs no more amplification than the statement, I walk down on the street, with the qualification of, on my feet. So the mythic theory fails here as well. There is one theory that can account for all the data. The resurrection theory, because the tomb was empty because Jesus had risen from the dead. The mythic theory fails because we argued from the facts which are known to be early. The conspiracy theory cannot account for the nature and quality of the disciples' testimony, the empty tomb, or the conversions of Paul and James. The hallucination theory relies on too many rare multisensory group hallucinations that make the disciples spread a message that nobody was anticipating. Only the theory that was reported adequately explains all the data. So as we can see, when we look at our little table here, is only the resurrection theory that actually ticks all the boxes. So how does one determine historical fact? The criteria that one can use are explanatory scope and power. It can explain all the facts and does so with the least amount of effort. It's the least ad hoc. It adds the fewest amount of assumptions in order to explain the data. Plausibility. Other areas of knowledge suggest the same theory. According to the historian Ramin Lolachi, the resurrection theory meets 3 out of these 5 criteria better than any competing theory. It has explanatory scope and power, and offers illumination to other areas of history. He does claim, however, it fails on the other 2 counts, saying it is less plausible and more ad hoc. But let's have a look at this a little bit more. This idea of ad hoc. According to McCullough, to be ad hoc means a number of new suppositions are made by a hypothesis that are not already implied in existing knowledge. David Travis Campbell, a philosophical theologian, helpfully points out, however, it is difficult to see why the resurrection hypothesis is extraordinarily ad hoc. It requires only one new supposition, that God exists. Rival hypotheses require many new suppositions. For instance, the hallucination theory requires multisensory hallucinations which are rare in individuals to happen in multiple individuals, multiple times, and for all of these hallucinations to be identical for every single person present, which still doesn't account for an empty tomb. For the conspiracy theory to work, you need to posit that the disciples who were in fear of their lives had decided to pull off the most outrageous hoax, then fake a resurrection, which was not expected in Second Temple Judaism, get Jesus' body out of a guarded tomb in a public area of town, all in order to get themselves martyred. Skeptics decided to join their persecuted movement. For what? Again, too convoluted, doesn't hold water. The mythic theory requires an extra assumption for each early fact, that it was actually made up later and bears only the appearance of being early. The resurrection theory, however, adds only one assumption: God exists, which isn't actually ad hoc if you combine this with the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. For the person who is already a theist, the resurrection hypothesis does not introduce a new assumption, since belief in God is already implied by existing knowledge. As a result, Dr. Travis Campbell categorically states the resurrection hypothesis cannot be said to be ad hoc simply by virtue of the number of suppositions it introduces. What about plausibility then? Could the resurrection theory be implausible? The definition McCullough uses for plausibility is that other areas of knowledge suggest the same theory. As I mentioned, why would the resurrection theory not be plausible if we already have arguments for God's existence? As William Lane Craig says, only if the naturalist has good reasons to think God's existence is implausible could he justifiably regard the resurrection hypothesis as implausible? If one insists on naturalism being true, and therefore if it is implausible that God exists, you are arguing from a presupposition and not being open to the mountain of evidence presented. As such, Anthony Flew, a very famous atheist philosopher turned theist, was bold enough to say, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It is outstandingly different in quality and quantity. The resurrection is the only theory that explains all the data without being ad hoc or implausible. As historian Paula Fredrickson says, they must have seen something." Thank you very much. So, folks, do we have any questions or comments?
I'm trying to think of what contemporary thoughts would be, and I guess it would be the historicity of history. It's probably the well, it's not really history, or the history must be wrong, or something like that. And it sounds like biblical scholars, skeptics, and believers alike, will say that it's historical. I guess, is it just something that one cannot convince something about the historicity of historical events, or?
Well, it's odd. I think a lot of this comes from Hume's view, and Hume's claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And for me, I've always thought that seems like nonsense, because you're arbitrarily setting the bar higher than it would be for anything else. If a claim is made, then the same degree of evidence should be used for any claim made. You shouldn't arbitrarily set the bar higher just because you don't like the way it turns out. But yeah, I suppose the history is problematic. I mean, as a scientist, I like things that I can test and I can prove and I can see the evidence in front of me. Historians seem to have a much harder job.
Well, it's helpful that there are a number of that Josephus is corroborating some of this.
Yeah, and he's hostile, actively hostile towards Christianity.
Right.
What is ad hoc? What is ad hoc?
It's a Latin phrase. It means something along the lines of sort of made up. So you just put bits and bobs together because it suits you, rather than because it logically holds water. But I mean, if we go back in this context, where is it? So in this context means a number of new suppositions are made by a hypothesis that are not already implied in existing knowledge. So that basically means that you're having to say all of these new things that there doesn't seem to be evidence for elsewhere. You're having to make assumptions for these things that you hadn't made before. And so if you have to make loads and loads of these, then it just starts to make ad hoc, because it means you have no foundation. It's like you're building your house on sand, and it's just going to collapse. Does that make sense? Good. It seems like we have a backing track this evening.
Lay down some fat rhymes. So, they're obviously still skeptical biblical scholars.
Yes.
Are they all in the conspiracy camp, or do they sort of have their own? I mean, how? Obviously, this isn't convincing to everybody. So, where do they still?
I think. Well, I mean, they basically, they mostly fall along either conspiracy or hallucination. For the most part, is my understanding. However, I can't say that I know what all their opinions are, so that's just what I've come across so far.
Because it seems like the most popular one is the mythic theory, that it was created by Christianity 300, 400 AD. Maybe they finally assembled the Bible then and came up with all kinds of things.
Maybe on a pop level, but no scholar affirms that.
Right.
Yeah, I suppose the thing is that they're obviously, even if they don't believe, they're a lot closer to the facts and the evidence. And so then things like the mythic theory get ruled out. So then if they're skeptical, they have to look elsewhere. Right, well, if there's no more, I'd like to thank you very much for listening and for turning out this evening. And have a lovely evening, folks.